Hi, everyone. Thanks for being with us today for this Rockstar webinar. We're going to be talking today about writing for non-academic audiences, something that a lot of you in office hours have expressed interest in. Some of you have experience with this, some of you desire experience with this. And I think Kate is a really fantastic speaker to talk about this, which is why I was so excited that she said yes to doing this webinar. So many of you know Kate, obviously, from Rockstar Office Hours. Those of you who do not, you should jump in and say hi. She's awesome. So in addition to being a Rockstar coach, she also is a longtime writer of various sorts and currently writes a column for the Baltimore City paper, and is perhaps going to talk a little bit about that, as well as maybe some of her past experience writing in a variety of different venues and different mediums and for different audiences, and specifically how you all who are currently graduate students or former graduate students, some of you have just graduated, can get into writing for public audiences. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Kate and we can just jump in. Oh, during the webinar, if you have questions or comments or things that you want Kate to address, just put them in that chat column on the right-hand side of the screen and we can get to them in the Q&A.
All right, thank you so much, Kathy. I'm gonna go ahead and pull up my PowerPoint. So this is the last time you'll see me in person for the next bit of time, but here we go. So this is a webinar on writing for non-academic audiences, and I think it's really important to think about how we can write for different groups of people, and that's something that a lot of us in grad school and after grad school are not necessarily encouraged to do, or maybe we are, and we want to know how to do so and how to get paid for it too. So we're going to talk about some of those things today. So I wanted to start by talking a little bit about why we write. And
sorry, Kate, can I interrupt you? You're not sharing your PowerPoint right now.
Not sharing it? Okay, hold on. That's no good. All right, hold on. How about now?
There you go.
Okay, great. Well, that's embarrassing. All right. So why do we write? And I think it's important to start here to really spend some time reflecting on why we want to write in public. I have a PhD in rhetoric, and one of the things that I learned in that rhetoric program, one of the things I learned in that rhetoric program was that writing is how we come to know things. Writing is how we learn. So I don't know if this happens to you, but one thing that happens to me often when I'm writing is I sit down and I don't know what I'm going to say, or don't really understand an argument that I'm trying to go through in my writing. And the way I learn that, figure that stuff out, is by actually doing the writing. So I wanted to sort of emphasize that writing is a way we come to know things, and we shouldn't forget that when we think about writing in public. The second reason that a lot of us write is to jump through hoops. You write to finish the course, to pass the qualifying exams, etc. And that's that writing is sometimes writing we do to learn things, but it is often writing that we feel like we're just gutting through to get out. If you're in the later stages of your dissertation, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The passion you might have felt at the beginning of the project starts to wane, and you start to hate it, and you start to write just to get through it, and that's when you know you're almost done. And just a tip, you will love writing and your topic again, I promise. A third reason a lot of us write is because we like to get liked and retweeted on social media. And I think it's fine to go ahead and be open and honest about this. One of the, because it's not just about ego, it's often also about influence. We've spent a lot of years learning, reading, teaching, and there's no reason not to be excited to share those ideas with a wider audience. Another reason that we might write, and this is the one that blew my mind after graduate school, is that you can get paid to do it. This is wild news, but it's true. You can't get paid like you could in the olden days, back when the writing for the internet paid $10 a word, but you can still make some spare cash doing this. And I don't know about you, but I sure need a side gig or two to afford paying the student loans and other expenses that come from being in grad school for so long. And I just wanted to return finally to this idea of writing to learn. Writing for public audiences has a special, I think, can be especially helpful in learning because it requires so many translation skills to write for a different audience. So I just wanted to start with that and talk about a little bit about writing in general. So why would we write for non-academic audiences? I think there are a lot of good reasons. The first, which I ended with in the last slide, is I think the most important, one of the most important, is to practice translation skills. Taking your theoretical writing, the writing's not theoretical, but writing about theoretical things for an academic audience and translating them to be accessible to a wider audience is often that last step of really truly understanding what it is we think we're arguing. And I think that's really important. That's really important work. It's something I ask my students to do. It's something that we probably do in that middle stage of like writing notes from difficult texts before we translate back into the appropriate discursive tone for our disciplines. But I think that writing regularly for non-academic audiences can get us into this really important habit. Secondly, I think we should write for non-academic audiences in order to reach more people with our ideas. The average academic article, I think, is downloaded something in the humanities, is downloaded something like 7 times. Don't quote me on that number, but very, very rarely. So a lot of us will spend a lot of time and resources and research producing a piece of writing that very few people will ever read. My dissertation, for example, I think was fully read from start to finish by maybe 3 people other than myself. So it doesn't reach a wide audience. This is not at all to dog that kind of writing. I think it's still really important. I think the work we do as academics in those writing realms is really, really important for advancing certain kinds of knowledge, for stretching disciplines in new ways. And there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to take some of that knowledge and reach more people. Another reason to write for non-academic audiences is to make connections with other scholars. It's the car in the background. The same connections that we make when we're, say, networking at a conference, we can also make online through our writing. Through writing for different audiences, I've made a ton of connections as I've moved from place to place as my writing has followed me. And I think that's something that we can do as writers for public audiences, not only with other academics, but also with community, with people, community organizers. I write a lot about bicycling, for example, and the last couple cities that I've moved to, itinerant academic here, it's been a way into new communities to meet new people and help organize for something that's important to me, road safety. And then finally, to get paid, everybody needs a little extra scratch. And I got to tell you, it's not a lot of money, so not something to get too excited about. But I make a few $100 a month doing a small amount of public writing, and it makes a big difference in what I can afford to do for my cats. All right. The next thing I want to talk about is when we should write for non-academic audiences. And this is, I think, something we really need to reflect on for a long time before we commit to any kind of public writing program, especially if we're still in graduate school or we're in the early stages of an academic career. I think you need to think about, so what are your priorities? Is your priority to finish your dissertation? If that's your priority, it might be the case that all your writing should be focused on your dissertation, on moving that forward. If you have coursework or something that you need to get through, maybe writing needs to focus on that. At the same time, maybe the writing for non-academic audiences is, say, like a valve, a pressure release valve from the stresses of writing for academic audiences. Maybe it helps remind you that you have your own personal voice, right? So sometimes when we're in the dissertation or coursework or dissertation phases of a career, public writing can be a good thing as a way of stretching our writing muscles and reminding ourselves that we're still ourselves even through the alienating process sometimes of graduate school. At the same time, it can also be a distracting technique that keeps us from actually finishing the work that needs to get done. So it's worth being really honest with yourself about what your priorities are in terms of your writing goals. The next thing I think it's important to think about is why you would want to write for non-academic audiences. Is it because you want to get certain kinds of ideas out there, or is it really about distracting yourself? So similar to what I was talking about in terms of your priorities, think about what your sort of goals are. If it's to make money, is there a side gig that's easier and could make you more cash faster? It's worth thinking about. You know, is your goal to reach more audience, a broader audience with your ideas about something that's politically relevant immediately? Then public writing might be the right thing to do. And then finally, I think it's worth reflecting on your values. You know, what are your values in relation to our jobs? What do we value, and how does that shape what we write and who we write for? By this, I just mean is, do we feel like we're doing work worth doing when we're writing for academic audiences? You know, I feel like that's work worth doing. Is that where I want to put my energy? Or do I really want to build a kind of public writing audience, because it takes a lot of work and a lot of time to do it seriously. And so if you're looking for, say, building a writing career outside of graduate school, it's worth thinking about why and how that might add value to your life or not. All right, so let's assume that you've decided you do want to write for public audiences. The question now is, where should you do it? And I think that for a lot of academics, we spend a lot of time writing, and we think it might be, I don't know, maybe we think it shouldn't be that hard to get our voices out there, or we read a ton of stuff online and a lot of it's not very well written, so there should be space for our voices. And it turns out it's actually really hard to, there's so many voices, it's hard to sort of break through the noise of it. So I want to talk about a few different places where you might look to write for non-academic audiences. The easiest way, of course, is through a personal blog. And this is a strategy that I don't even think it's a strategy. I have a blog that I've been running for about 10 years, and I post regularly on it. And it's called What I Saw Riding My Bike Around Today. And I started it on a lark because I needed something to distract myself from the heartbreak of breakups and a terrible job market. So I started the blog mostly to have an outlet for my own writing. Excuse me. And anybody can start a personal blog at WordPress or blogger.com. Super easy to do. It is actually, I never thought it would lead to anything, but it has. In a lot of ways, it's been the most important writing that I've done, even including work I did in graduate school. And here's why. First, writing a personal blog regularly means that you are writing regularly. And the key to being a writer, whether it's an academic writer or a public writer, is to write. And it's to write all the time, it's to write every day. Having a commitment to a personal blog that I would write on at least 5 days a week meant that I was producing 200 to 400 words a day, 5 days a week. That's a lot of words, and a lot more than I produced as a dissertator who was facing constant writer's block. So the personal blog can be a great way to jumpstart your writing. So one thing I did when I started the blog is that would be the first writing I did for the day, and then I would go on to it would sort of get me warmed up for writing, and then I would go on to my academic writing. So it can be really helpful in both senses. It also, if you write regularly, can be something that other people start to read, and you can start making connections with people who have similar interests. If you read other blogs and comment there, they'll often read your blogs, and you can build a really interesting community of readers and thinkers around something you want to write about. And there's so many blogging communities that a lot of us would fit neatly within, right? Like feminist academic blogs about alt academic life, blogging communities about feminism, blogging communities about all kinds of issues that are a natural fit for the kind of work we're doing as academics. So personal blog is a super low barrier to entry kind of public writing that can get used to writing. And it can also be something that you can use then when you go to pitch to other places. You can say, here's an example of my writing. So for example, my personal blog, it was, I posted regularly, a link to it to Facebook and to Twitter, and eventually when I moved to Baltimore, people saw that blog who worked at our local alternative weekly, and they asked me to start writing for them based on that writing. So surprising connections can be made through personal blogging. So it's good for learning to write and then also for making other connections later. If you're interested in blogging, but you don't want just the katedrabinski.com version of a blog, you can look to places like Huffington Post, Medium, and other online public blogging sites. Medium is just another platform to host your blog, but because of the way that it makes connections and sends out regular, you can sort of collect followers who get regular emails about your posts, that can be a good place to build that personal blog. I want to talk for a second about Huffington Post. This is, for a lot of academics, I know, the place they want to first get their public writing out there. Huffington Post it seems to have the imprimatur of being some kind of a news site or something. So getting an op-ed on there feels really good. And I see a lot of academics writing there. I want to say one quick thing about that, which is that Huffington Post doesn't pay any of its writers. It is a huge site that makes a ton of money, but the people who write for it are all of us, just sort of volunteer academics. And that's something to consider when you think about pitching a story to a place like Huffington Post and not asking to get paid. A lot of people won't write for Huffington Post because it feels like being a scab. And it's worth thinking about the politics of writing for free for these public sites. They're inundated with academics who are looking for a public spot to place their writing. And that means that writers who are professional writers or who make their living as writers, as freelance writers, for example, no longer really have a market. So that's worth thinking about, sort of the politics of that. But that is a place where you can pitch a story, and a lot of academics find a home there. Once you pitch one and get in, get in there, it's often easy to keep publishing there. Next, I want to talk about local and regional publications, newsletters, and websites. As Kathy said at the beginning, I write a column for the local alternative weekly, and I got that gig by sort of by chance because of my own personal blog, and someone they had decided was going to write, they'd had a writer set up for the Pride issue a few years ago, and that writer dropped out, and they said, hey, can you do this? Because we've seen your writing here, and you're gay, so maybe you could write it. And I said yes, and I had to throw it together quickly, and it was a lot of work, but it was a good way to get my foot in the door. If you live in a town with an alternative weekly, chances are they are on the ropes financially, and they don't have a lot of cash, which means they don't have a lot of staff writers. And you can, and this is a terrible situation, but they're often the only way they can get content is by paying freelancers to do the writing. And there's no reason that can't be you. So it's worth giving them a shout to see if they might have room for you. Also, check out the larger papers in your area. The Baltimore Sun, for example, I live in Baltimore, often runs op-eds and columns by academics talking about certain issues. And I think that can be really helpful to get published in sort of a place where more people will be reached. You can also look at, and this is a different kind of public writing, but I've done some writing for newsletters for example, the Mid-Atlantic Public History organization asked me to write a piece about Baltimore. Look at the sort of newsletters and websites for the professional organizations, and they might have some writing they need to get done. And those are places that will generally pay you, not a lot of money, but some money, and that feels, I don't know, less terrible in terms of our labor. The other sites you might, or other places you might think about are what I call the big time, the Atlantic, Slate, and the Guardian, and sites like that. Those are also places to consider. They accept pitches, they regularly publish academics, and if you can land a piece in a place like that, or say the New York Times Magazine, you've really hit the big time and the jackpot. Those places are really, really hard to get pieces in, but it's not impossible, and it's worth thinking about spending. If you are deciding to build a writing career outside of academia, it's worth thinking about how you might, it's worth thinking about spending time crafting pitches for those kinds of places rather than writing articles for academic journals. That's a choice that once you make it, it's really hard to go back. So that's my warning about that. But those are other places to consider. Now I want to talk a little bit about how to write for non-academic audiences. I think when we've been in graduate school for a really long time, we forget how to write for someone else. I can't tell you how many things I've written myself that I thought were super accessible, only to discover when I asked my girlfriend to read them that they were not. Learning to write for non-academic audiences means a whole different set of concerns. And we all know this, right? I mean, you know this when you're writing your essays for your class, or when you're writing for a certain professor, or when you know that something that you write, the chair of the committee is going to love it, but you're worried what the historian is going to say. Right? So we all know this, but I think it's worth reminding ourselves of these three parts of rhetoric that go into this writing. Ethos, logos, and pathos. So ethos is just about, right, the ethical appeal. How do you construct yourself as a writer, and what's your personal voice? That's something that you develop over time, and it's worth getting feedback from other people who are outside of the academy to see if you've got one. I know for me anyway, after 7.5 years of graduate school, my personal voice had been pretty much beaten out of me. And it took a long time to redevelop. And that's one of the reasons I think starting with a personal blog can be really helpful, because you can find your own voice again after that loss. And developing that personal voice is also what's going to make you marketable and appealing to folks in, at other places where you pitch your pieces. Second, you got to think about the logo, so the logic of the arguments you're going to make and the writing you're going to do. Academic writing relies so much on citation, and non-academic writing doesn't want any citations at all, really. And when you're using quotations from people or from texts in non-academic writing, there's no flower around it. It is just, it's just a different style. Pay attention while you're reading the newspaper, for example, and you'll see how differently quotations are used there than somewhere else. So when you're writing a piece, really, it's so different from writing for an academic audience that it's worth taking a step back and thinking about how logic works differently in, say, a newspaper or an editorial, what kinds of appeals you make, than it does elsewhere in academic writing. And then finally, this is something I'm sure we all understand as well, but pathos, thinking about the pathetic appeal. Who is your audience and how will you appeal to it? Think about what makes people read something. So whereas in an academic article, for example, using the first person is sometimes, depending on your field, something that would actually detract from the quality of your argument, or it's the wrong kind of appeal to make to your reader. In non-academic writing, if it's not journalistic, is absolutely appropriate. An emotional appeal, right, using examples that are trying to tug on heartstrings in academic writing is often frowned upon. It's often something that is alienating for a lot of us from academic writing. But in non-academic writing, the story or the example that brings up a kind of emotional, that is a kind of emotional appeal to the reader is exactly what you need, right? So sometimes, so that kind of writing is really different. And again, I think the way to see the differences is to spend more time reading on purpose for some of these differences. Right, so once you have sort of decided this is what you want to do, the question is how to make a pitch. And the personal blog, you don't have to make a pitch. You pitch yourself and you've accepted the gig, so you're good to go. But for any other kind of writing, you have to make an actual pitch. And the publication will determine how those pitches are made. My first suggestion is to read widely. Figure out what are the places that regularly publish the kind of thing that you want to talk about. So, for example, I'm working on a piece that's about the Harriet Tubman Byway and the use of public memory for understanding how landscapes work and what's the landscape of slavery. So I could write an academic article about that, but I'm more interested in writing for non-academic audiences because that's where my career is headed. So I have to read widely and see what are the kinds of places that would publish that kind of not immediately topical, but highly researched piece, right? Where would it go, right? So I have to read a lot of different kinds of venues to see where it might fit. So that's the kind of piece that I would pitch to a place like The Atlantic, because they regularly publish longer form researched articles about things like that. Right? I wouldn't pitch that to Huffington Post, for example, first because I don't want to write for them, but also because that's not the kind of thing they do. They're more timely and news-based site. So read widely so you have a sense of where the kinds of things you might want to write about might fit. The second and most important thing is to use connections. The way in the door is to know somebody who's already in the door. It's not fair, right? This is why the same people get you win the first fellowship and then you just win the rest of them, right? Well, I mean, it's not that easy, but it sure helps you get in the door. I got into graduate school, and I'm sure it had something to do with the fact that my undergraduate advisor was really good friends with the chair of the search committee or the admissions committee that year. Right? Connections are sadly and maddeningly the way a lot of these things happen. Right? So a cold pitch to somebody at the Atlantic probably isn't going to go anywhere. If you look through their masthead, find an editor who you think if you either know or they know somebody you know, which is more likely, they are 2 degrees of separation or something. And so ask your networks if they know anyone, or find an editor who seems to publish on the thing that you're interested in writing over and over again. That's the person you're going to pitch to, and you're going to mention those connections. And this part sucks, if I'm being honest. You get your foot in the door often because somebody's already cracked it open for you. And one way to think about this, I think, is that we do get in the door and we start writing publicly, is that we bring other people along and we bring other voices in who aren't being listened to, right? So it's one way to think about it, but there's no way around the kind of dirty part that the way you get to write in public is because somebody who knows somebody. Next, when you're making a pitch, you want to be timely, right? So if you're writing for some venues, this matters less, but for a lot of venues, it needs to be hooked to something. Your public writing needs to be hooked to something that's happening now, right? So I started sending out the Harriet Tubman pitch when they came out with the Harriet Tubman Quarter, right? Because it seemed to be connected to something that was happening. And this is, the deadlines for academic writing. We'll start something that I remember I had an academic article published once that from the time I started writing it to the time it actually came out in publication was 4.5 years. I mean, that's just wild to me, right? But the timeline for public writing is much, much shorter. And so if something happens that you want to write about, you need to write about it immediately because the news cycle is just so quick, right? It just moves so fast. So for example, if you want to write about, sorry, this is a terrible example, but Bachelor in Paradise just got canceled, and there are going to be a lot of issues coming up around sexual assault and alcohol use and whether or not it's a spectacle, right, that are going to happen. So if I wanted to write about that, right, I have some training in that and thinking about and talking about those issues, I would need to be sending out my pitches yesterday, right? So be really timely, and it means that you have to write very quickly. And then finally, making the pitch, get ready to be rejected or more likely ignored. There's so many pitches coming in from so many places, and so many of them are terrible and so many of them are good that editors are often just deleting those emails, right? So it's a lot of throwing things out to the void, right? Think job application time, right? When you're just throwing out as many as you can, and sometimes you never hear anything, or you hear something 8 months later, right? It's just, I will say that writing for public audiences has helped me grow a much thicker skin in regards to rejection. And I guess that's a good thing, because that is the field we're in. So in terms of the nitty gritty of making a pitch, what you need to do is sort of go onto the website of the place where you want to place your piece and look at the details there about how to send the pitch. If you know an editor, or you have a connection in some way, or you can have somebody else make the connection, that'll make that connection faster, and you can send your pitch directly to that editor but you always start with what the rubric is from the publication where you're writing for. I want to say a few things about working with editors, because a lot of us have a lot of experience working with professors and with dissertation advisors, for example. And editors are similar, but they're also really different. And here's how they're different. First, deadlines really matter. As academics, we can often sort of push off a deadline. It's almost a running joke, right? That I turned it in 3 weeks late, so it was early. I'm currently working on an edited volume with 28 different academic writers, and the deadlines have just gone, they're just in the wind, right? Because people just turn things in when they do. And it's part of the practice of academia, and part of why sometimes I think academics are people who would not survive in the real world, because deadlines matter in a totally different way outside of academia. Editors are on a deadline. They need to get the thing to press, or they need to put up the website. So you miss a deadline and you're not a reliable writer anymore, and chances are you're really going to struggle to work with them again. If you work for a newspaper, for example, I write a bi-weekly column. It's due on Thursdays. Very occasionally I've turned it in Friday morning, and I always ask in advance if that's okay. And it is so far, right? But you don't want to push deadlines, because editors, they're just not working on a different schedule than academics. The next piece of advice is, I think, not only for working with editors, but also working for your academic advisors. Turn it in early and often, right? The way that our writing gets better is that we turn it in and it's edited and it's revised and suggestions are made, and then it comes back to us, and then we do a rewrite. This is as true with your academic readers as editors. A lot of us will hold on to our writing because we're afraid to let it go, and we know it's not finished, and we know it's not good enough. And if you're doing non-academic writing, or if you want to do academic writing and be successful at it, we have to learn to let go. You've got to let go and let other people give you feedback, right? And we're often really scared to do that, but we have to let it go. And editors can really, their job is to work with you and make your writing better. So if you're lucky enough to ever get to work with an editor, take advantage of it. For public writing, though, it's important to remember that there's an editorial voice that matters too. It's not just your voice as a writer. And this is kind of hard, I think, to wrap our minds around, because we have an argument we want to make and a style in which we write, and an editor will often just chop that up. They'll take out the best bits, they'll insert their own stuff, they'll pick a headline that's just terrible. A couple of years after the Baltimore uprising, I did an interview with Bicycling magazine about my experiences biking around Baltimore during the uprising. And I said over and over again, this wasn't a riot. This wasn't a riot. And when it came out, the headline was Bicyclist Reports Live from Riot. And I was so angry because I'd said so many times that's not what it is. But part of writing in public is knowing that they've got their own agenda that might not be yours, right? They're going to get a lot more clicks from Bicyclist Reports from a Riot than Bicyclist has reasonable, reasonable and thoughtful things to say about the political past of Baltimore that gave, this is just not interesting to them. So that editorial voice will definitely shape some of your public writing, and that can be hard for a lot of us, but be prepared for it. And again, as academics, we might be used to it coming from professors. On that note, though, know when to pull your piece. If the editors want to make too many changes, or the changes taken in a direction that you can't live with, pull it. It's just not worth it. Once it's on the internet, it will follow you around forever. And if you don't feel good having your name on it, take it back, right? And you might worry about burning a bridge, but your integrity also matters, and there will be other bridges, right? So sometimes you need to pull a piece. That hasn't happened to me yet, but it's happened to friends of mine, and it's just worth knowing that you're able to do that. All right, now the fun part, getting paid, what I call the freelancer's dilemma. Oh my gosh, it's so hard to get paid sometimes. So here's just a few tips. Be clear on whether or not you're going to get paid from the jump. Don't expect that I remember the first time I wrote, the first article I wrote for our local alt weekly was a cover story, and I didn't know if I would get paid or not, and I didn't ask. And when I got paid, I was surprised, and I said thank you. And that set a terrible tone for my work with the newspaper, right? Of course I should get paid for it. It's labor. You're selling ads based on this content that I produced. I should get paid for it. And it's best to be clear about that from the beginning. My second tip, if you're writing for multiple public outlets, is to use an invoicing system. If you just Google free invoice, something will come up. The one I use is invoicegenerator.com, and keep track. And sometimes it's very little money, but if you don't have the invoice, you forget sometimes that you were owed $50 or something, and then you don't get it, and that's not fair. Third, don't be afraid to nag. Sometimes you have to nag to get paid, and sometimes you have to nag a lot, and it's a total drag. There was some human resources mix-ups at a place where I was writing for, and I went 3 months without getting paid, and it was so aggravating and upsetting, but I just kept nagging every week, and I did eventually get paid. And that was important. But you also sort of have to be somewhat patient, because payroll departments are as slow as the universities. You know how it is. You get hired as an adjunct, and then they mess up your paperwork and you don't get paid for another, till October. It's appalling, it's unjust, and it happens. And unfortunately, sometimes there's nothing to be done about it. And then finally, and this is super important for freelancers in any field, any side gigs you have, remember the taxes. If you write for one of these like a new organization, or I write for the Tronc is the name of the Chicago Tribune company now. It's called Tronc. I write for them. They're going to send you a tax form, right? So you 1099 at the end of the year, and you will have to pay taxes on that amount. I would suggest putting aside 25% to a third of whatever you take home in freelance pay in order to pay your tax bill, because the taxes on freelance income is actually quite high. So we're not talking about a lot of money, but at tax time of owing a few $100s that you didn't expect can be really devastating for a lot of us. So think ahead. Also, if you're going to file as a independent contractor, as a writer, I would suggest a couple of things. One, think about getting an accountant. Two, think about tracking your expenses. If you start writing regularly and it becomes something that's part of your income, there's a lot of expenses that you can deduct that that TurboTax or an accountant can help you deduct, that can offset some of the taxes for freelancing. It takes a while to get to the problem of having too much money that you need to hide it from your taxes, but hey, we're going to think positive. All right, and then also want to talk a little bit as we come to a close here about does this writing count? And I think this keeps a lot of people from writing publicly, because what about our careers? If I write regularly for for Slate or something, does it count towards getting a job? Like, will hiring committees think it's interesting or important work, or will they think it's frivolous? Will a tenure committee think that it counts or it was a distraction? These are really serious issues when we're thinking about our careers. So these are sort of a couple questions to keep in mind when you're thinking about, but does it count? First, who's counting? If it's the tenure committee, it might not count for them. If it's me, it might count for me personally, because because writing is a pleasurable activity and I got to learn something new through my writing. It might count towards my bank account, right? So think about who's doing the counting and whether or not it matters. If you do get a job offer from someone, from a university, it's worth asking them if this kind of writing, if it could be in the contract, if this kind of writing could be considered part of your career trajectory. We just did a hire in my department, and the new hire does a lot of, she writes a lot of poetry. She's not brought in as a poet, she's brought in as an academic researcher about her field. But she actually worked through the hiring process to make sure that her creative output would also count. So it's worth asking if you ever get to that stage in a job search. And also, what are your goals for your career and where you see things going? And that will help shape whether or not it counts and to whom. And then also think about, like, how could you tell? Like, how do you tell if it counts? I'm off the tenure track at my job, and it doesn't, quote, count, but it counts in terms of me building connections and a career that might be my next gig after I leave academia, right? So it sort of depends on who's counting and what your rubric is for whether or not it counts. Can you tell I work in academic, like in the academy, talking about rubrics? Anyway, and then finally, the question, how do I start? And how you start writing for non-academic audiences, really just to write, and then write some more. The way that we build audiences for our public writing and the way that we develop our own voice through our public writing is just by writing. And that's true whether you're doing academic writing or non-academic writing. For me, writing regularly in a non-academic way for the last 10 years has helped me form a voice that I think is unique and that sometimes I get paid for. And that's been really, really valuable, and it's really helped me understand myself and my world better. And that's, if we're thinking about what counts, I think that totally does. So good luck with your public writing. You're writing for non-academic audiences, and I'll go back to the crowdcast now.
Okay, so I'm gonna bring this up, hopefully.
Screen?
Kate, on the bottom of the video screen, there should be a button that says something like stop sharing screen.
Yeah,
I can also close it. That might be easier.
Yeah, can you close it? Because for some reason it's not.
Yeah, I just did. Why is my video not coming up? Oh, because I have it turned off. There we go. Okay. Hi. So Linda had a couple questions during the presentation, which, let me scroll up to the beginning. So Linda's first one is a general question. When your topic is highly theoretical, something even academics may struggle to understand, for example, literary theory, and you're trying to make it accessible to a public audience, how do you frame it with enough background to get the readership situated quickly? Yeah, so how do you balance enough background so they understand what you're talking about with the accessible tone?
Oh, wow, that is such a good question, and it's really hard, and I think it's especially hard when we're in the depths and weeds of our academic work. And I think that I have a couple of things, and Kathy, I'd be interested in your view. One is to figure out what part of the background is most necessary to understand the thing that you're going to write about, right? Like, you can't give all the readers all of it. So what do they actually need to know? Sort of starting out with, say, a story or an example, I think can be really helpful to do that. I don't know, Kathy, what would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good way to approach it, as well as think about, I advise this in any kind of writing actually, but I think it's particularly useful in public writing and in short pieces, and that this would include journal articles too, is that you can only make 1 point. We want to make 1 million. Like, as academics, we want to make 1 million points, and we want to point out the nuances of everything. And we've been instructed in good ways, but also some kind of comical ways, that like everything is super complicated. Everything has 17 layers. Nothing is simple. Nothing is straightforward. Nothing is what it seems, right? And it's part of how we're trained as scholars, and it's not a horrible impulse, but it produces some really ugly writing because we just try to keep cramming more and more information into a piece, thinking that that will actually make the one thing we're trying to say more clear, and it doesn't. It muddles it. So I would say, when you identify what that one single point, the really small single point you want to make in a piece, and then provide just the background enough, as you were saying, for a reader who's never heard of that thing to get that one single point. They don't need to know the whole history of the thing. They don't need to know, like, all of the social movements that preceded it. They don't need to know unless like that's your point, but they don't need to know how that idea has changed over time. They don't need to know what Foucault had to say about it. They don't need to know what anyone else has to say about it, actually. That's why you're writing that piece, right? So like figuring out what's that one point, and then what are the teeny tiny bits of background that they need to get your point about the thing.
Yeah, and I mean, that question is like, that's the hardest thing to do.
It totally is.
Theoretical and break it down, and you'll know how much you're leaving out and how much, and know that your audience is not going to get out of it everything that you might put into it. So in my weekly column, my bi-weekly column, for example, I write, if it depends what your background is, what you learned from what you read. I mean, you could just think that you're reading a funny story from Kate, but oftentimes in the background is a lot of theoretical stuff that if you're in the field you would see and recognize, but otherwise you might not. So it sort of depends on your audience. Yeah.
One thing that can also be nice too about public pieces versus academic pieces is, so when we're writing academic pieces and we want to give more background on something or more context, or here's what a whole bunch of other people have said about this topic, we provide citations, right? Yeah. In public writing, you don't do that. Like you acknowledge when you're using other people's ideas, that kind of citations, but you don't use like academic citations. But what you can do that's super awesome is hyperlink. Mm-hmm. And so that can function, and it depends on the publication, but almost all online publications take advantage of this basic infrastructural element of the internet. So when you want to gesture towards there's a much broader conversation about this, but I don't have room to talk about it here, you can put a link to an article that somebody else wrote or a series of articles that other people wrote without commenting on it, mm-hmm. right? Like the hyperlink itself functions as, go read more information about this over here if you care.
Yeah. I'm looking at some of the other questions, Linda, that you had. And the question about the importance of getting your blog linked by other blogs is really, you're absolutely right. I think that the sort of my first general tip would be to link other people's blogs on your blog. So with WordPress, for example, on that blog, when I first started the blog, I would post a lot on other people's blogs as comments or to try to build up connections with other bloggers. And that was sort of a way to get reposted, is to do some reposting yourself. That would sort of be my biggest tip for that.
And then also having a social media strategy around it, right? The internet is large enough at this point that putting something up there doesn't mean anything, right? Like it's way back when it was first starting, yeah, people would know if you happened to throw something on the internet because there were like 10 people on it. But there are many more than 10 people on it these days. So like you posting something online, no one will find it. Unless you build the audience who cares about your voice, who cares about your topics, you feed it over time, you nurture it over time, and you build some type of consistent social media sharing strategy that keeps your piece in front of the eyes of the people who are the best readers for it, right? And that would mean something like building, and there isn't a one size fits all for this, but if your communities, your ideal readers, if they're on Facebook, get yourself on Facebook and start building those communities. If they're on Twitter, go hang out on Twitter a lot. If they're on Instagram, wherever it is that they're hanging out, you need to be there and be part of those communities, such that when you have something to pitch them, you're already known, they already know who you are, they're anticipating what you have to say about topics because they think you're smart and they want to hear what you have to say about it. And then just being consistent with it.
Yeah, and there are some sort of minutiae tips, right? Like post in the morning, because people are more likely to read at breakfast or when they first get into their offices than later in the day. Don't post on Thursday or Friday. Tuesday and Wednesday are like statistically the best days to get read. This piece from Huffington Post, for example, posting that link, whatever the article was about, in different Facebook groups or tweeting at certain other authors or people with a link to it who you think might be interested, retweet that, to get them to retweet that, or just to have it show up in other social media spaces. Also, don't forget that your university probably has a communications department, and they probably want their professors and graduate students to be doing things. So I will regularly throw a link to the person who does communications, and they'll put it up on the university website or something like that. And if you do it a lot, sometimes the school newspaper will do a story on how you're a writer for Huffington Post or something. And these small things add up and help build significant readership. So those would be some other sort of practical tips I would have.
One thing that I've found that I've had to do, I apologize for the background noise. Apparently there's some truck that is decided that this would be a good time to like park outside my window and make a lot of noise. So I apologize for that. One thing that I found in blogging on the Ideas on Fire blog over the past couple years is that I had to, it didn't feel like I had to, it felt like I got to let go of a lot of the defensiveness of academic writing, which was hard to learn to undo, but was so much fun and so much better. And writing in a tone that's more similar to how you teach is one way that I found helpful to approach that. So when you're explaining something to students, you don't use jargony words because they've never heard of those. They've never heard, they haven't read everything you've read, right? They're 19 years old. Of course they haven't. And most of them never will because they're not going to become academics because most students don't. So you've figured out over time how to teach very complex ideas in very simplified, accessible terms, right? And you might be in the process of learning that if you just started teaching, for example. But thinking about how you would explain this to a 19-year-old first-year student, or I guess 18-year-olds, whatever age you are when you are first year, can be a good way to start to train yourself into a tone that a broader readership can understand.
Yeah.
And think about how many examples you bring into the classroom, right? Like we bring tons and tons of examples. It's like when you're trying to explain some complex idea like the panopticon, you don't just stick with Foucault, right? You put up examples of particular prisons, or you show a clip from a movie or from a TV show, or you know, a meme or something like that. Those are all things that you're learning how to explain complex ideas in more accessible language, and you can adapt that in your writing.
Yeah. All right, I see this other question. Is it realistic to pitch something to a publication like The Atlantic if your name is not known? First, I would say no. I mean, chances are it's just gonna go into the ether, right, and not be read. At the same time, I would say yes. If you have a really well-developed pitch and you find an editor on that site who you think would be particularly interested in it, and you send it to them directly, and you follow up a week later and say, hey, did you see this? But realistically, chances, like I wouldn't spend a lot of time developing that pitch unless you've already sort of got a track record of public writing and you maybe have a connection or two. So like I have a friend who has written for a long time for The Guardian. So if I wanted to place something at The Guardian, I would probably ask him, like, who would you put me in touch with? And that's when connections make a real difference, which totally bums me out, but it's just true.
It's like that in academia too, though. It's not like academia is somehow pure or better in that context. Like, how do you get academic publications? You find out about a special issue, call for papers from your colleague or from your friend or from your advisor, like, and you get ins like that.
When I look at the author list at Duke University Press, for example, I see everybody I went to grad school with is now on Editorial Voice, and they're publishing all of my friends. Like it is not, it is in every industry. It just really is depressing sometimes. So if you aren't the one who knows all the people, I guess.
But it's also a lesson to go hang out with those people, like build those connections, and recognizing that the communities and the relationships you build aren't separate from your career. They are your career.
Yep. They're your
regardless
career.
of, yeah, regardless of whatever field you're in.
Yeah. Right, any other questions?
Doesn't seem like it. Okay. Well, if you have lingering questions about public writing, or you think of something tomorrow that you wish we had addressed, you can always catch Kate or I in Slack in office hours, and we're happy to talk through some of that with you. So thanks for being here. Our next webinar coming up is next week, actually, and this is a public webinar, so it's open to anyone. Please encourage anyone you think might be interested to come on by. And the topic of that is art and community-based research. And so any of you who are interested in performance studies or kind of projects that are not traditional scholarship, but scholars can use, this is going to be a really, really great webinar. Amarjeen Christian, who's the founder of Open TV, he's also an assistant professor at Northwestern University, is going to be talking about how he founded Open TV, which is a television production company, a web-based television production company that produces work from very early in development all the way through to distribution of queer people of color media. And so he's going to talk about how he did that as an academic, this very non-academic project, but then approached it as research. So actually media production itself as research, and then how he wrote a book about it, and has done a lot of work in this kind of navigating between the kind of media or art production world and the academic world. So I highly encourage you to stop on by. That's on June 21st. From 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you can join us live, register anyway. You can always watch the replay. It's going to be pretty awesome.
Cool. All right. Thanks so much, Kathy.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.